Alright everybody, we are continuing chapter 3 and we are going to talk specifically about epithelial tissues in this video. So we're going to talk about structure and function of epithelial tissues. We're going to talk about different types of junctions for these epithelial tissues and the different cell shapes and arrangements of those cells that can happen in this tissue type, and then also compare endocrine and exocrine glands, which are another part of this epithelial tissue. Alright, so epithelial tissues, these tend to be large sheets of cells that cover all of the surfaces of the body that are exposed to the outside world, and then also sheets that are lining the outside of organs inside of the body. So there's a lot of different features of these, both structurally and functionally. The first is that these sheets of cells help provide a lot of protection from a lot of wear and tear from physical environments, so like clothing rubbing against your skin or scraping it on something. You know, if you scrape your arm on something, you're not always going to start bleeding immediately or anything like that because your skin is pretty protective from that physical damage. Chemical wear and tear, so chemical exposure. Some chemicals obviously can get through your skin, but not all of them. Your skin is going to help reduce the chances of a lot of chemicals getting through. And then biological wear and tear. So that can be other things. So we do have bacteria on our skin that work with those cells to kind of help protect us from pathogens. But the skin also, even without those added bacteria that are very normal to be on our skin, it's still going to help provide some protection from pathogens getting into our skin, into our body, and into those organs. So these sheets are highly cellular, so there's lots and lots and lots of cells making these up. There's not a lot of extracellular material between cells, so there can be fluids and some different types of fibers and stuff in between cells. We'll see that come up a lot when we do the connective tissues video, that extracellular material you'll see a lot there, but we don't really get a whole lot of it, if any, in epithelial tissues. A lot of these cells are going to be connected via certain types of junctions, so we're going to look at some different types of junctions that are forming these connections, and the cells also are polar, and the two surfaces for this polarity are called the apical surface and the basal surface. Alright, we'll get into what those mean in just a little bit. And these tissues are almost completely avascular, which means that they do not have blood vessels supplying those particular cells. So the very top layer of your skin, for example, that has no blood vessels in it, that very outer layer. It's the deeper layers of your skin that are going to have that vasculature, those blood vessels. And this is why, like I said earlier, if you scrape your arm on something kind of lightly, you might see some skin kind of flaking off, but you're not seeing bleeding every single time. That's because that surface layer does not have vessels in it. And then, I forgot that I already put this in, but cell junctions again. So let's move on. So here are three types of cell junctions. We have tight junctions shown up here, gap junctions shown right here, and then anchoring junctions. And so each of these types of cell junctions have a different purpose. So tight junctions are, as the name implies, very, very tight. They're holding the cells very, very tightly together so that there's no space in between those cells allowing anything else through. So we've got some transmembrane proteins here that are going to be in between those cells attached to those plasma membranes, and then we do have some intracellular space in there as well, but we're not talking about that right now. We're looking at these cell junctions. Gap junctions, as the name implies, form a gap in between the cells. And so there are certain things that we do want to have them pass through that layer of cells. So certain substances do need to get through the cells, and not all of it should go through the plasma membrane to the inside of the cell and then out the plasma membrane on the other side of the cell. Sometimes it's much more efficient to have these connections between the cells, have just little gaps in them that certain substances can move through to get from the surface of the cell to the base of the cell. So we see some of these happen in the small intestines because we want to move certain nutrients down below that cell layer. And then our anchoring junctions are going to help keep those cells stuck together. All right. And so there's three different types of anchoring junctions: desmosomes, adherins, and hemodesmosomes. So desmosomes are going to have all of these interlocking fibers in the middle. So we've got some glycoproteins there in the middle, and then on the outside we have some intermediate filaments made out of keratin, same thing as our skin and nails. And so those are going to help really keep those cells tightly together. Adherins help things adhere together. A little bit different structures here. So instead of having those keratin filaments, we are looking at actin filaments on the outside of those junctions, those anchors for those junctions. But in between, we do still have those transmembrane glycoproteins. And then hemodesmosomes, as you can see in this little image over here, these are located at the very base of the cells, so where the cells are attaching to the layer underneath them, and so they are going to help keep those epithelial cells stuck to that layer underneath them. All right, so these look a little bit different, as you can see, but that basal lamina is that bottom surface of the cell where it is connecting to tissues underneath it. All right, so epithelial tissues are classified according to the cell shape seen in that tissue and the number of cell layers that we see in that tissue. So we have three different cell shapes: squamous cells, cuboidal, and columnar epithelial cells, and then we can have layers that are simple layers, that's a single layer of cells. Stratified is going to be more than one layer, and then we have a couple specialized layering styles. Pseudostratified, so this is going to look like the cells are stratified and in more than one layer, but they're actually not. They're actually just in one layer, but the shape of the cell makes them look like they might be more than one layer. We'll see that in a moment. And then transitional epithelium is going to kind of have some different shape cells in different stages of growth and stuff like that. So we are looking at some comparisons here. So the squamous cells, these are going to be relatively flat epithelial cells. So if we have simple squamous epithelium, we are looking at a single layer of these small flat cells, and then if we have stratified squamous epithelial tissue, then we're looking at multiple layers of those flattened cells. Next type, cuboidal, they are roughly cube-shaped, as the name implies, so we can have a simple cuboidal epithelium, and we have those in a single layer, or we can have those that be stratified in multiple layers. And then we have our columnar epithelial cells. So the shape of these are going to be columns, as you can see. So these are going to be a bit more rectangular shaped. We can have simple columnar epithelium. We can see a lot of these in various digestive organs. We can see that brush border right here, some villi and microvilli. We can have stratified columnar epithelial tissue, and then we see pseudostratified columnar epithelial. So these columnar cells, as you can see, are kind of odd shapes. No two are the exact same shape or very similar in shape, but as you can see, the location of that nucleus and the shape of the cell can lead, in some cases, to making this look like it is multiple layers and like it is a stratified type of tissue. All right, so here are some histology images. So these are actual cells from the body that have been stained using special dyes, and we're looking at them under the microscope. So these are images of simple squamous epithelia. So we can see those small flattened cells right here, and they're going to be in a single layer. And we can also see those endothelial cells over here that are also simple squamous. And so this right here is not one of those squamous cells. Just that tiny little layer there is the simple squamous layer. Here we have simple cuboidal. Again, we are looking at this layer right here, and then we've got some other ones out here. So those cuboidal epithelial cells in a single layer. Here are simple columnar epithelial cells. You can kind of make out how each of those is going to be in a column, and that nucleus is going to be up there towards one side of that cell. And here are pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. And so you can kind of see, now that we're looking at real cell tissue, how the location of that nucleus can kind of make it seem like there are multiple layers of these cells when there's actually not. So there is one nucleus per cell, and depending on where that nucleus is located within that cell can make it look like it's either a higher up layer or a lower layer. But this is not layered. These are just cells lined up side by side rather than stacked on top of each other. Alright, goblet cells are another type of cell found in some epithelial tissues. These are going to usually make a lot of mucus, so we have a ton of goblet cells in our respiratory system and in our stomach. Our stomach needs that mucus lining to help protect it from the acid there. And if we have goblet cells residing within a certain epithelial tissue, then we're going to see them kind of squeezed in between two different of those epithelial cells. And again, those are going to produce mucus and excrete it out into that opening at the top side of the cells. Alright, now we've got stratified epithelial tissues. So we've got some stratified squamous cells over here in image A, so you can see all those little kind of flattened out cells stacked up on top of each other. In here we have some stratified cuboidal cells. Little harder to see because we'd have to zoom in quite a bit. And then we have some columnar cells over here, also in that stratified setup, one on top of the other. And then this is transitional epithelial tissue. So transitional epithelial tissue can kind of change the appearance depending on what the purpose is. So one common area of the body that we see transitional epithelial tissue is actually in the bladder, because the bladder is going to need to stretch as it fills with urine that's being produced in between using the restroom to eliminate that urine. And so this transitional epithelial tissue can look stratified in some cases when the bladder has maybe just recently been emptied, and so it's shrunk back down to its non-full size. And so this is what it's going to look like in that case. And then as the bladder fills up with urine and starts having to expand like a balloon, then all of these cells are going to start getting stretched out from each other, and they're not going to look like that stratified layer that we're kind of seeing in this particular image. They're going to start getting a lot closer to looking like it's a simple layer of just one single layer of cells. All right, we don't see a ton of transitional epithelial tissue in the body, but the bladder is a very, very common location that we see it in the human body. All right, let's talk about glandular epithelium. So this includes endocrine and exocrine glands. So endocrine glands are part of the endocrine system, and so these are going to produce a lot of hormones. These are ductless glands that release their secretions, so the hormones they make, directly into the tissues and fluids that are around those cells. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, these are going to have ducts, so what these glands produce, those secretions, are going to travel through that duct and then get either into the fluid surrounding it or the external environment. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. So either it's going to open directly into the external environment, or it's going to need to kind of open to a different area of the body before getting to the external environment. So exocrine glands can be unicellular. We saw an example of this with those goblet cells a couple slides ago, or they can be multicellular exocrine glands. So this is a little bit of a complicated chart because there can be some overlap with the duct system and tubes and stuff like that. So up here in this box are simple duct exocrine glands. And so we have simple alveolar exocrine glands. These are not found in adults. These are only found in a stage of development, early on in embryonic development and fetal development, so adults are not going to have these anymore. This is just kind of an in-between phase, the starting place for everything else. Then we can have simple branched alveolar duct systems, and so you can see here we're going to have some different little sections, those gland cells, producing whatever that secretion is. In this case, these are sebaceous or oil glands, so we have these all over our skin to help keep moisture in our skin and keep it healthy and from getting dried out and cracked and stuff like that. And so these cells in here are going to produce that oil and then secrete it into this duct system inside, and then it is going to get sent out to the external surface of those cells. Coming over here to our more tubular shaped ducts, we have simple tubular ducts. These are found in the intestines to produce some various secretions of the intestines depending on which section of the intestines we're at. We can have simple coiled tubular glands and ducts, and so you can see a lot of glandular cells in here. These are one of our multiple types of sweat glands. So murocrine sweat glands are like this. So these cells in this kind of pinkish red orangey color are going to secrete that sweat, and it is going to travel through that duct and then out to the external environment. And then we can have this simple branched tubular duct system. So we've got gastric glands, so some of the ones in our stomach, producing different secretions like acid and stuff like that, as well as mucus glands can be these simple branched tubular, so goblet cells are not the only ones that are going to make mucus. We do have other types of mucus glands in the esophagus, tongue, and duodenum of the small intestine. And then down here at the bottom, these three down here are all compound ducts rather than simple ducts, and then we also still have either the alveolar or tubular setup. So compound alveolar ducts, we find these in breast tissue. These are mammary glands. These are going to produce milk, so those cells will produce that milk. That will get moved through a bit more complicated of a duct system and then secreted out to feed growing infants. Over here on the other side, we have the compound tubular duct system. So we've got more tube-shaped ducts here that those cells are arranged in. So these are going to be mucus glands in the mouth, the bulbourethral glands in the male reproductive system, as well as the testes. So the seminiferous tubules are also in this particular arrangement. And then a unique type that we see here in the middle, kind of overlapping both the alveolar and tubular shapes, are compound tubulo-alveolar ducts, just to make it really complicated. And so salivary glands, certain glands in the respiratory passages, and then the pancreas are going to be this kind of duct setup. And so a lot of times we need some different substances being produced in the same location. So salivary glands are going to produce not just something to help moisturize the mouth and start breaking down food particles just from moisture alone, but we also need certain enzymes in our saliva like amylase that starts breaking down carbohydrates really early on. And so different types of duct cells or gland cells are going to produce those different substances, but they can all get secreted from the same location, so we're not taking up unnecessary space. All right, so methods and types of secretion. So we have Merocrine secretions, like I mentioned, that is one type of sweat secretion, apocrine, and then holocrine secretions. And then we've got types, which are sebaceous and mucus glands. So sebaceous glands are going to produce watery secretions rich in enzymes, and then mucus glands will produce a watery to viscous or thicker product rich in the glycoprotein mucin. All right, so let's dive into these different modes of secretion a little bit more. So merocrine secretions, these are the most common type of exocrine secretion in the body. So what happens here is these cells are going to produce whatever their secretion is, that substance that they need to produce, and that's going to get enclosed in vesicles and then released through exocytosis on the surface, that apical side of the cell membrane. All right. So that's a little bit different than other types of secretions that we looked at with those ducts and stuff like that. So we are releasing things through vesicles in this particular situation. So the glycoprotein mucin, this is a lubricant that also helps with some pathogen protection. So getting us protected against certain bacteria and viruses and stuff like that. This is a type of merocrine secretion. And then aerocrine glands, we didn't talk about those today, but they're going to produce and secrete sweat, are another example of this. So these are our sweat glands, released through vesicles of all things. Next up is our apocrine secretion, seen here in this middle area. So apocrine secretions, basically, as you can see here in this diagram, we're getting all of these vesicles, and they're kind of all collecting up here at the top of that cell. This is the apical side of the cell that's going to open into either the external environment or the body's internal environment, whereas the basal side is down here, again, connected to that underlying tissue. So we're getting all of these secretions sent into the upper portion, that apical portion of the cell, and then the cell actually pinches that region off and just kind of tosses that away and then refills whatever is needed from losing almost half of that cell. So most of the sweat glands in our body are merocrine glands, but we do have apocrine sweat glands in certain areas of our body, like the axillary region, so in our armpits. And so this does make sweat as well. So we actually have two different types of sweat. We'll cover this a little bit more in some other areas of this class, but we do have two different types of sweat. You do sweat constantly throughout the day. You just don't notice it because it evaporates pretty much immediately. And that's what's mostly coming out of these merocrine glands. Whereas those apocrine sweat glands, you can tell this would be a lot of sweat produced very, very quickly. So the armpits, hands, and feet tend to have these types of sweat glands, and this is also, we're going to have these in other areas of our body. They're just in really high density in armpits, hands, and feet, which is why those tend to be the first locations on our body to get really, really sweaty when we start working out or are really stressed or something like that. So that is apocrine glands, but this does not damage the cell. The cell can just refill that cytoplasm and stretch out that plasma membrane back to its original shape so that it can do this all over again. It's kind of cool, I think. And last but not least are holocrine secretions. So this actually means that the entire cell is going to rupture. So these cells are going to produce whatever secretions they're making, and then once they've made a certain amount of that secretion, they are going to rupture and burst to release that particular secretion, and then we get new holocrine gland cells from the nearby tissue. We get that differentiation from the nearby cells into these particular gland cells. So a lot of the sebaceous glands that produce oils on our skin are holocrine glands, which is kind of interesting. We also have these same types of cells in the hair follicles to produce some of that moisturization for the hair as well. And that wraps up the epithelial section. We will continue in the next video talking about connective tissues.